Fire had already taken the west stable by the time Alara Whitmore reached the courtyard, her bare feet slapping against wet stone, her breath tearing out of her in short white clouds. Smoke rolled low across the grass, thick and orange at the edges where the flames still bit into the old wooden beams. Somewhere inside, a horse screamed. "The doors are jammed," a groom shouted, pulling uselessly at a bolt swollen tight by the rain from the night before. "We cannot get them open." Alara did not stop to think. She grabbed a length of iron bar leaning against the well and drove it into the gap between the door and its frame, throwing her whole weight against it. The wood groaned. Somewhere behind her she heard boots on gravel, fast and heavy, and a voice she did not yet know cutting through the chaos. "Move aside." She did not move aside. She had no time for pride, and neither, apparently, did he. A man's hands closed over hers on the bar, and together they wrenched the door free just as the roof beam above it cracked and sagged. Smoke poured out in a black wave. 2 horses bolted past them into the night, wild-eyed, manes singed, and a third had to be dragged by its halter, coughing and stumbling, by the man who had appeared at her side. Only when the animals were safe, tethered far across the yard, and the last of the flames had been beaten down with wet sacking and buckets hauled from the well, did Alara turn to look at the man who had helped her. He was tall, dark-haired, his shirt scorched at one sleeve, his face streaked with soot. His eyes, pale gray in the torchlight, studied her with an expression she could not read, surprise, perhaps, or something closer to suspicion. "You are the Whitmore girl," he said. It was not a question. "I am, sir." "You could have been killed just now." "So could you," Alara said before she could stop herself. For a moment, something almost like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then it was gone, replaced by the tired, guarded look she would come to know so well in the weeks that followed. He was Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Harlyn, master of the crumbling estate she now called home, and this was the first time she had ever stood close enough to see the exhaustion carved into his face. He turned from her without another word, and began giving orders to the men still smothering the last of the embers. That was how Alara's life at Harlyn Manor truly began, not with a quiet welcome, but with fire and smoke, and a man who looked at her as though she were a puzzle he did not have the patience to solve. She had arrived 3 days earlier, a trunk in her hand and nowhere else in the world to go. Her parents, the estate's former steward and housekeeper, had died within a week of each other during the winter fever, leaving her with no home, no income, and no family beyond a promise the old Duchess had extracted from her son before her death. A promise that the Whitmore girl would never be turned out to fend for herself. The staff called her the charity case, though never to her face. She heard it anyway, the way one always hears the things people believe cannot be heard. She heard it in the kitchen when the cook complained of another mouth to feed. She heard it in the hallway when the upstairs maids whispered about her plain dresses and her silence. She was given a narrow room at the end of the servants' corridor, cold in the mornings and colder at night, and a place at the edge of the kitchen table, and she was grateful for both, because she understood, better than any of them, how close she had come to having nothing at all. What none of them understood, what she barely understood herself in those first days, was how much she had brought with her besides an empty trunk. Her father had managed the Harlyn accounts for 20 years before his mind began to fail him. Her mother had kept the great house running on a fraction of what it should have cost, stretching every shilling until it could stretch no further. Alara had grown up listening to numbers murmured over supper, learning the difference between a fair price and a cheat's price before she had learned her letters properly. It was not a skill anyone had thought to give her on purpose. It had simply happened, the way a child raised near the sea learns to read the tide. And so, on her second morning at Harlyn Manor, while sorting linens in the small room off the kitchen, she found herself staring at a ledger left open on the table, and she could not look away. The numbers troubled her immediately. Flour purchased at nearly twice the price it should have commanded. Coal delivered in quantities that did not match what the household actually burned. Rent collected from the tenant farms that fell, again and again, short of what the land itself should have yielded. She said nothing. She was new and unwanted, and it was not her place to question the running of a house that had taken her in out of pity rather than need. But she noticed. She could not help but notice any more than she could help breathing. The fire that night changed something, though she could not yet say what. Perhaps it was simply that the Duke had looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time instead of past her, the way the wealthy so often looked past the poor, as though poverty made a person transparent. Perhaps it was that she had seen him afraid, just for an instant, before duty smoothed the fear from his face and turned him back into the composed, distant master of the house. Whatever it was, Alara found she could no longer pretend she did not see what was happening to Harlyn Manor. The house itself told the story, if anyone cared to read it. The east wing had been closed for 2 years, its furniture draped in white cloth, its fireplaces cold. Rain had gotten into the roof above the old library, and a stain the shape of a spreading tree had crept across the ceiling, ignored because there was no money to repair it. The window glass in the servants' corridor was cracked and had been cracked. Mrs. Prout told her without being asked, since the old Duke's time, patched with paper instead of replaced. Tradesmen came to the kitchen door now instead of the front, and left again with faces set hard, muttering about accounts unpaid for months. "His Grace does not like to speak of it," Mrs. Prout said one evening, kneading dough with more force than the task required. "But we all know. The old Duke left debts enough to swallow this house twice over, and his son inherited them along with the title, whether he wanted either or not." "Does no one help him?" Alara asked. Mrs. Prout gave a short, humorless laugh. "Help costs money too, girl. And pride does not like to ask for what it cannot repay." Alara thought of the ledger she had seen, of the numbers that did not add correctly, of a household bleeding money through 100 small wounds that no one had thought, or dared, to look at closely. She thought of the Duke's face in the firelight, tired in a way that had nothing to do with one night's sleep lost. She said nothing more. But that night, lying awake in her narrow bed while the last smell of smoke still clung faintly to her hair, Alara Whitmore made a quiet decision that would change the course of her life, and his, though neither of them knew it yet. She would watch. She would learn everything this house had to teach her about its own ruin. And one day, when the moment was right, she would find a way to be more than the charity case they believed her to be. Outside, the last embers of the stable fire hissed and died in the rain that had begun to fall again, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away the danger of the night. But the danger to Harlyn Manor was not the kind that rain could put out. It lived in ledgers and unpaid debts, in pride too stubborn to ask for help, and in a house slowly, silently falling apart around the people who loved it most. Alara did not yet know how deep that danger ran. She did not yet know the name of the man who had been quietly stealing from the estate for years, hiding his theft inside numbers no one thought to question. She did not know that Lady Beatrice Calloway, the Duke's own cousin, watched the crumbling of Harlyn Manor not with sorrow but with calculation, waiting for the moment the estate would fall so low that Edmund would have no choice but to marry his way out of ruin, on terms that suited her family perfectly. All Alara knew, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, was that the fire in the stable had been the first crack in a night that would not stay quiet for long, and that somewhere close by, more danger was already gathering, waiting for its moment to strike. Morning came gray and slow, the sky still heavy with the smoke and rain of the night before. Alara rose before the rest of the house, as she always did, and made her way down to the kitchen to help lay the fires before the cook arrived. It was in the quiet of that early hour, with only the crackle of new flame and the distant call of a rooster for company, that she first noticed the man standing at the edge of the ruined stable, alone, studying the blackened timbers with his hands clasped behind his back. She should have turned away. It was not her place to approach him, and certainly not at such an hour, in her plain work dress with her hair still loosely pinned. But something about the stillness of his shoulders, the way he stood as though carrying a weight far heavier than a burned stable roof, made her pause at the edge of the courtyard. "It can be rebuilt," she said, before she had quite decided to speak at all. Edmund turned, startled, as though he had forgotten anyone else in the world existed. For a moment his expression was unguarded, and she saw plainly what Mrs. Prout's careful words had only hinted at, a man exhausted not by one bad night, but by years of trying to hold together something that kept slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he gripped it. Then the mask returned, smooth and practiced. "Everything can be rebuilt given enough money," he said. "Unfortunately, Miss Whitmore, money is the one thing this house does not have." It was the first time he had used her name, and something about hearing it in his voice, low and clipped and entirely without warmth, made her stand a little straighter rather than shrink away. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "someone ought to look closely at where the money that remains is going." His eyes narrowed, not with anger but with the sharp, assessing look of a man unused to being questioned by anyone, least of all a servant girl 3 days into his household. "And what would you know of it?" "Only what I have seen in a kitchen ledger left open on a table," Alara admitted. "Prices that do not match what such things ought to cost. Rents that fall short, year after year, from land that should yield more." For a long moment he said nothing at all, and she feared she had gone too far, spoken too boldly, given him one more reason to see her as nothing but a burden he had been forced to accept. Then, to her surprise, he asked, quietly, "Show me." It was not warmth. It was not even trust, not yet. But it was the first crack in the wall between them, and though neither of them could have known it that gray, smoke-scented morning, it was the beginning of everything that was still to come. The study door had barely closed behind them when Edmund Ashworth turned the key in the lock, a habit born of too many secrets slipping past too many careless servants. Alara stood just inside the threshold, the morning light falling across a desk buried under papers, unopened letters, and a ledger book so worn at the corners it looked ready to fall apart entirely. "You wish to see numbers," he said, gesturing at the mess with something close to bitterness. "There they are, make of them what you can." She had expected reluctance. She had not expected him to simply hand her the truth of his ruin and walk away to stand by the window, arms folded, as though he could not bear to watch her read it. Alara sat, smoothed her skirts and began. It took her the better part of an hour to understand what she was looking at, and by the time she finished, her hands were faintly trembling, though not from fear. The estate's finances were not merely mismanaged. They were being drained, slowly and deliberately, by someone who understood exactly how to hide theft inside the ordinary chaos of a great house's accounts. Coal was purchased at prices no honest merchant would charge. Flour, meat, candles, all of it inflated far beyond fair market cost. Worse, rents from 3 of the largest tenant farms had been recorded as paid in full, yet the corresponding sums never appeared to have reached the estate's bank. "Someone is stealing from you," she said finally, looking up. Edmund did not turn from the window immediately. "I am aware the estate is losing money, Miss Whitmore. I did not require a maid to tell me that." "I do not mean the estate is losing money through misfortune, Your Grace. I mean someone is taking it, deliberately, and doing it cleverly enough that it looks, on the surface, like nothing more than bad luck and rising prices." That brought him around at last. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and looked over her shoulder at the ledger, at the columns of figures she had circled in pencil borrowed from his own desk. His jaw tightened as he followed the trail she had marked, the pattern of it, once seen, impossible to unsee. "Doyle," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Your steward. He has managed these accounts for 6 years. Since before my brother died, since before any of this," he gestured again, wider this time, encompassing the whole ruined weight of the house, "fell to me." Alara said nothing. It was not her place to accuse a man she had never met of theft on the strength of an afternoon's reading, however certain the numbers seemed to her. But she saw the way Edmund's expression had changed, the exhaustion of the morning replaced by something colder, sharper, more dangerous. "You could be wrong," he said, though he did not sound as though he believed it. "I could be," she agreed, "but I am not." He studied her for a long moment, the same searching look he had given her in the smoke-filled courtyard the night before, as though trying to decide what manner of creature had washed up on his doorstep. My mother believed you would be an asset to this house, he said at last. I confess I thought it sentiment. A dying woman's wish to ease her conscience over a debt owed to your father's long service. And now I am no longer certain what to think. He closed the ledger with more care than he had opened it. But I would like you to look further, discreetly. Say nothing to anyone, not even Mrs. Prout. If Doyle is doing what you suspect, he will not hesitate to protect himself, and I do not yet know how far his reach extends within this household. It was, Alara realized, the closest thing to trust anyone at Harlyn Manor had offered her since her arrival, and it came from the last person she had expected to give it. Over the following days, she moved through the house differently, watching not only the ledgers left carelessly on tables, but the people who moved around them. She noted how the steward, a heavy-set man named Doyle with small, watchful eyes and a habit of smiling too readily, seemed always to know exactly which room she had entered and when. She noted how quickly certain papers disappeared from the study when she came looking for them a second time. She began keeping her own notes, hidden inside the lining of her trunk where no curious hand would think to search, copying figures late at night by candlelight when the rest of the house slept. It was dangerous work, though she did not fully understand how dangerous until the evening she returned to her room to find the lock on her trunk had been forced, the contents disturbed, though nothing appeared to be missing. She stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, her heart hammering, understanding with sudden clarity that whoever was stealing from Harlyn Manor now knew that someone was watching them. She said nothing to Mrs. Prout. She said nothing to the other maids. But that night, for the first time since her arrival, she went to find Edmund directly, knocking softly on the study door long after the rest of the household had retired. He opened it himself, still dressed, a glass of untouched brandy on the desk behind him, as though he too had found sleep impossible. "Someone searched my room," she said without preamble. Whatever composure he had maintained through their earlier conversations cracked, just slightly at that. "Are you certain?" "My trunk was locked." "It is locked no longer, and everything inside has been moved, however carefully." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful distance entirely. "Then we must assume Doyle, or whoever assists him, knows you have been looking into the accounts. From this point forward, you will not go through the ledgers alone. Whatever you find, you bring directly to me and to no one else." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Alara," he stopped himself, as though surprised by his own use of her given name, and for a moment something almost gentle passed across his face before the mask of the Duke settled back into place. "Be careful. Whoever is doing this has had 6 years to grow comfortable, and comfortable men do not surrender what they have stolen without a fight." She did not sleep well that night, nor for many nights after. But she did not stop watching either, and it was that stubborn, quiet refusal to be frightened away from the truth that would, in the weeks to come, prove to be exactly the thing Harlyn Manor needed most, even if neither she nor Edmund yet understood how close the danger circling them truly was, or how far Lady Beatrice Calloway was already prepared to go to make certain the estate's ruin served her own ambitions rather than its master's recovery. Lady Beatrice Calloway arrived at Harlyn Manor 3 days later, unannounced, in a carriage far grander than anything the estate itself could now afford to keep in its own stables. She swept into the entrance hall in silk the color of a winter sky, her smile wide and practiced, her eyes moving over the faded carpets and dusty portraits with the quick, assessing glance of someone counting exactly how much longer a thing could be expected to last before it broke entirely. "Cousin Edmund," she said, taking his hands in both of hers before he could so much as bow, "you look positively haunted. This house is doing you no favors, you know. Ruins are so terribly aging." "Beatrice?" His voice was courteous but flat, the voice, Alara thought from where she stood near the stairs with an armful of linen, of a man greeting an obligation rather than a guest. "I have come to see how you are managing," Beatrice continued, still smiling, though her gaze had already found Alara and lingered there, cool and measuring. "And who is this?" "Miss Whitmore, she assists in the household." "Ah, the charity case." Beatrice said the words lightly, almost kindly, and that was somehow worse than if she had spoken them with open scorn. How good of you, Edmund, to honor your mother's wishes so faithfully. Though I confess I wonder whether the estate can truly afford such generosity, given everything. Alara said nothing, only inclined her head and continued on her way, though she felt Beatrice's eyes follow her the entire length of the hall. That evening, from the servants' stairwell, Alara overheard the beginnings of a conversation she was certain she was not meant to hear. Beatrice's voice, pitched low but carrying in the empty corridor, drifted through a half-open door. You cannot keep pretending this house will right itself, Edmund. The debts grow larger every season, not smaller. Marry sensibly, and all of this becomes someone else's burden to solve. My father's fortune could clear every debt this estate carries within a 12-month. And in exchange, I imagine, you would want a great deal more than gratitude. I would want what any sensible arrangement requires. Control where control is needed. You cannot run this house on pride alone, cousin, however much you might wish to. Alara did not hear his answer. Footsteps approached the door and she withdrew quickly into the shadow of the stairwell, her heart pounding, understanding with sudden, uncomfortable clarity exactly what kind of rescue Lady Beatrice intended to offer, and exactly how much it would cost the man who accepted it. She found herself, in the days that followed, watching Beatrice nearly as closely as she watched the ledgers, and what she saw troubled her more with each passing day. Beatrice spoke often and easily with Doyle, the two of them falling into low, private conversations that ended abruptly whenever a third person entered the room. Beatrice asked pointed questions of the staff, questions that sounded like idle curiosity, but were, Alara began to suspect, something closer to reconnaissance. She wants the estate to fail, Alara said to Edmund one evening, when they had once again retreated to the study after the rest of the household had gone to bed, ledgers spread between them like a battlefield map. Not because she wishes you harm, necessarily, but because a failing estate is one you cannot afford to refuse rescuing, on whatever terms she offers it. You believe my cousin and my steward are working together. I believe it would explain a great deal. How would Doyle's theft remain hidden for 6 years, unless someone with influence in this house made certain no one looked too closely, and who benefits more from Harlyn Manor's ruin than a woman offering to marry her way into fixing it? Edmund was silent for a long time, staring at the fire rather than at her, his jaw working as though chewing on something bitter. If you are right, he said finally, then I am not merely fighting a thief, I am fighting my own family. You are fighting for your house, Alara said quietly. That is not the same thing as fighting your family, even if it feels like it. He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her suddenly, acutely aware of how close together they sat, how late the hour had grown, how the firelight softened the hard lines of exhaustion in his face, until he looked less like a duke burdened by ruin and more simply like a man, tired and afraid and grateful in spite of himself, not to be facing it entirely alone. Why does this matter to you? He asked. You owe this house nothing. You could have stayed silent, kept your head down, taken whatever charity was offered and asked for nothing more. Why risk yourself for a family that is not your own? Alara considered the question carefully before she answered, because she owed him, she felt, an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Because I have spent my whole life being told I did not belong anywhere, she said finally. This house took me in when it had every reason to turn me away. I would rather fight to save it than watch it fall while pretending I never noticed the cracks. Something shifted in his expression then, something she could not quite name, warmer than gratitude and quieter than anything he had allowed himself to show her before. He did not say anything more that night. But when she finally rose to return to her room, he stopped her at the door with a single, low sentence that stayed with her long after she had blown out her candle. Whatever else happens, Miss Whitmore, I no longer think of you as a charity case. It was not a declaration. It was barely even a compliment, but it settled into her chest like a small, steady flame, and it was enough for that night to carry her through the fear of what still lay ahead, and the growing certainty that the danger circling Harlyn Manor was far from finished revealing itself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a writer who did not wait for a reply, and by the time Edmund finished reading it, his hand had gone white around the paper's edge. "The bank is calling the loan," he said, when Alara found him still standing in the entrance hall, the letter crumpled slightly where his fingers had tightened. "The full amount, within 30 days, or they take possession of Harlyn Manor entirely." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she stood perfectly still. 30 days. It was nothing. It was less than nothing against debts that had been accumulating for years. "Can it be delayed, negotiated?" "I have already sent word requesting a meeting, but banks do not negotiate out of sentiment, Miss Whitmore, and I have given them little reason to trust that this house can recover what it owes." He folded the letter with careful, deliberate movements, the way a man folds something he cannot yet bear to think about. 30 days to find a sum of money that would take years to earn honestly. I do not see how it is possible. "Then we do not find it honestly," Alara said. "We find it by proving Doyle has been stealing it from you for 6 years, and we take back what is already rightfully yours." He looked at her sharply. "You believe we can prove it in 30 days?" "I believe we have no choice but to try." What followed was the most frightening and most alive Alara had ever felt in her short, careful life. She and Edmund worked together in the study nearly every night, poring over years of ledgers by candlelight, cross-referencing tenant rent rolls against bank deposits, comparing merchant invoices against the prices any honest household in the county could expect to pay. Slowly, painstakingly, a pattern emerged, undeniable once seen in full. A pattern of theft so consistent, so carefully hidden inside the ordinary noise of a great estate's expenses, that it could only have been the work of someone who understood exactly how such books were meant to look, and exactly how to make them lie. 6 years, Edmund said one night, staring at the final total Alara had calculated, a sum large enough to have cleared the estate's debts twice over had it never been stolen at all. 6 years, and I never once looked closely enough to see it. "You trusted him. That is not a failing, Your Grace. It is simply what decent people do until someone proves they should not." But knowing the truth and proving it to a bank, or to a court, were two very different things. Doyle's ledgers were carefully constructed, each false entry supported by a corresponding false receipt, each theft dressed up in the ordinary clothing of legitimate expense. What Alara and Edmund needed was something Doyle himself could not explain away, a record outside his own control, evidence that existed independently of the books he had spent 6 years learning to falsify. "The tenant farms," Alara said finally, on the 7th night of searching, when exhaustion had begun to blur the numbers on the page in front of her. "Doyle recorded their rents as paid in full, but if the tenants themselves kept any record of what they actually paid, any receipt or note, it would not match what Doyle entered in the estate's books. It would prove the difference went somewhere it should not have." It was, Edmund agreed, their best chance, and perhaps their only chance, given how little time remained. The following morning, before the sun had fully cleared the hills, Alara set out on foot toward the nearest tenant farm, a modest holding worked by a family named Caro who had farmed Harlyn land for 3 generations. Old Mr. Caro was suspicious at first, understandably wary of anyone from the great house asking questions about money, certain at first that she had come to accuse him of something rather than to help uncover an injustice done against him as much as against the estate itself. But when Alara explained, carefully and honestly, what she and the Duke suspected, and why it mattered, the old man's face changed, hardened into something closer to quiet fury than fear. "Paid every shilling we owed," he said, "and paid it early most years, hoping for the goodwill of it. If your steward wrote down less than what left my hand, then he has been stealing from us as surely as from his grace." He disappeared into the farmhouse and returned with a small wooden box, worn smooth with age, containing years of careful notations in his own hand, dates, sums, and the mark of the collector who had accepted each payment. It was not proof enough on its own, but it was a beginning. 2 more tenant families told the same story in their own words, with their own careful records, And by the end of the week, Alara had gathered enough independent testimony to draw a line, undeniable in its clarity, between what had actually been paid to Harlyn Manor and what Doyle had recorded as received. The gap between the two numbers was staggering. Yet even as the evidence grew stronger, the danger around them grew sharper as well. Alara began to notice a man she did not recognize loitering near the edge of the estate's grounds, watching the comings and goings of the house with more attention than idle curiosity could explain. Twice she returned from the tenant farms to find herself certain, though she could never prove it, that she had been followed along the lane. And one evening, returning later than usual from the Carroll farm, she found the study door standing open, papers scattered across the floor, the small locked drawer where Edmund kept their gathered evidence forced open and emptied entirely. She ran for Edmund, breathless, fear closing cold fingers around her throat, and found him already standing in the doorway of the ruined study, his face carved from something harder and colder than she had ever seen on him before. "They have taken everything," he said. "Every receipt, every ledger page we copied. Whoever did this knew precisely what to look for. Doyle, or Beatrice, or both working together exactly as you suspected from the beginning." He turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something close to despair beneath the anger. "We had 30 days to save this house, Miss Whitmore. We have used 7 of them already, and now we have nothing left to show for it." For a moment, standing amid the wreckage of the study, Alara felt despair reaching for her too, cold and heavy and tempting in its simplicity. It would have been so easy to give in to it, to accept that the thieves had won, that a girl with no name and no fortune and a duke with no money and no allies stood no real chance against people with power, and cunning enough to reach into a locked room and take exactly what they needed to protect themselves. But she thought of her father, of the years he had spent teaching her, without ever meaning to, how to read the truth hidden inside a column of numbers. She thought of the Carroll family's small wooden box of careful records, kept faithfully for years by people with far less power than she had, simply because keeping the truth mattered to them. "They took the papers," she said slowly, the beginning of an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "But they did not take what I know, and they did not take the tenants themselves, who will still speak the truth if asked to speak it again, before witnesses this time, in front of the bank's own men rather than only to us in private." Edmund looked at her, something sparking back to life behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "You believe we can still make our case?" "I believe we must," Alara said, "because the alternative is losing everything, and I have already lost everything once in my life, Your Grace. I do not intend to stand quietly and watch it happen to this house as well." It was, perhaps, the moment everything between them truly changed. Not the fire in the stable, not the ledgers shared late at night, but this. The moment Alara Whitmore, penniless and unwanted and dismissed by half the household as nothing more than an act of pity, stood in the wreckage of a ransacked study and refused, absolutely and without hesitation, to accept defeat. Edmund crossed the small distance between them and for the first time took her hand in both of his, the gesture entirely without the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival. "Whatever happens in the days ahead," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I no longer see this fight as mine alone. If we save this house, Miss Whitmore, we will save it together or we will lose it together. I will not pretend otherwise, not to the bank and not to myself." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old windows of Harlyn Manor as though the house itself understood how precarious its future had become. 23 days remained until the bank's deadline. Somewhere beyond the estate's boundaries, Doyle and Lady Beatrice believed they had already won, believed the stolen evidence had ended any real threat to their plans. They did not yet know that the truth they had tried to bury still lived, clear and unshaken, in the memory and determination of a girl they had never once thought worth watching closely enough. That mistake, more than any single ledger or hidden receipt, would prove to be the beginning of their undoing. The following morning, Edmund rode to the county bank himself, determined to buy what time he could with honesty rather than pleading. He returned by midday, his expression unreadable, and called Alara into the study before he had even removed his riding coat. "I spoke with a man named Fenwick, the bank's senior clerk," he said. "He has handled this estate's accounts for years and admitted, when pressed, that certain figures reported to the bank on Harlan's behalf never quite matched what he expected from an estate of this size and history. He has agreed to review our case personally, if we can bring him evidence within the remaining time. Then we still have a chance." A slim one. He was careful to make no promises, but he did not turn me away, and given everything else, I will take what small mercy I am offered. Edmund finally shed his coat, dropping into the chair behind his desk with the particular heaviness of a man who has spent a morning being polite to people who held his future in their hands. "We need the Caro family and the others to testify formally, in writing, witnessed, and signed. Memory alone will not satisfy a bank's clerk. We need something that cannot be dismissed as hearsay." It was Alara who returned to the tenant farms over the following days, this time accompanied by a young curate from the village church, a mild, careful man named Peter Ashby, who agreed, once the situation was explained to him, to witness and formally record each family's sworn account of the rents they had actually paid. It was slow, careful work, made slower by the fact that Alara could not shake the feeling of being watched every time she walked the lane between the manor and the farms. She was not wrong to feel it. On the fourth day, returning from the Caro farm with Peter Ashby at her side, a rider approached them at speed, drawing his horse up hard enough to send gravel scattering across the road. It was Doyle himself, his usually pleasant face twisted into something far less careful than his customary smile. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice pitched low and pleasant in a way that did nothing to soften the threat beneath it. "I hear you have taken quite an interest in the tenant accounts of late. I would advise you to remember your place in this household. Servants who meddle in matters beyond their understanding rarely fare well." "I understand the accounts perfectly well, Mr. Doyle," Alara answered, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage despite the pounding of her heart. "Better perhaps than you would like." Something flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared, but she had seen it clearly enough, not confusion, not innocence, but calculation, the look of a man measuring exactly how dangerous she had become to him. "A girl with no family and no name would do well to consider how easily such a position can be lost," he said, and though his tone remained pleasant, the words landed like a blow. "His Grace's charity extends only so far, Miss Whitmore. I would not test its limits if I were you." He rode on before she could answer, leaving her standing in the lane with her hands trembling, not from fear alone, but from a fury she had rarely allowed herself to feel so plainly. "He threatened you," Peter Ashby said quietly, once Doyle was well out of earshot. "He tried to," Alara corrected. "I do not intend to let it work." She told Edmund everything that evening, and watched his expression darken with an anger that seemed, for the first time since she had known him, entirely unguarded. "He will not touch you," he said, low and fierce. "Whatever else happens, whatever this house loses or keeps, he will not be permitted to threaten you and suffer no consequence for it." "I am not afraid of him," Alara said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was true. "Then you are braver than I am," Edmund admitted quietly. "Because I confess, Miss Whitmore, the thought of losing this house frightens me a great deal less than the thought of something happening to you, because of the risks I have allowed you to take on my behalf." The words hung in the air between them, warmer and more dangerous than anything spoken in the careful, formal language they had maintained since her arrival. Alara did not answer immediately, uncertain what answer such a confession deserved, uncertain even of what she herself felt beyond the steady, growing warmth that had been building in her chest for weeks now, ever since a firelit courtyard and a stranger's hand closing over hers on an iron bar. "Then let us make certain," she said finally, "that neither of us has cause to be afraid much longer." By the end of that week, they had gathered 5 separate testimonies, each carefully witnessed and signed, each telling the same damning story of rents paid honestly and recorded falsely. It was not everything. It was not perhaps enough on its own to satisfy a bank determined to reclaim its money regardless of who was truly at fault. But it was a beginning, hard won and dangerous, and it was more than Doyle or Lady Beatrice believed they still possessed. 20 days remained until the deadline. The fight for Harlyn Manor had only just begun in earnest, and Alara Whitmore, once dismissed as nothing more than an unwanted charity case, now stood at the very center of it, unafraid, unwavering, and utterly determined to see it through to the end. The scandal broke on a Sunday, in the middle of church in front of half the county. Alara had not expected it, had not even considered that Lady Beatrice might move against her so publicly, so soon. She sat beside Mrs. Prout in the servants' pew, her mind still turning over the previous night's ledger work, when Beatrice rose from her seat near the front of the church, mid-service, and addressed the vicar in a voice pitched deliberately to Carrie. "Forgive the interruption, but I feel a Christian duty to speak plainly, given the company gathered here today. It has come to my attention that a certain servant girl at Harlyn Manor has been observed removing money from the estate's strongbox. I would not have raised it in so public a manner, but I understand His Grace has been reluctant to act, out of some misguided sense of obligation to the girl's late parents." The church fell utterly silent. Every head turned first toward Beatrice, then, inevitably, toward Alara. "That is a lie," Alara said, rising to her feet before she could stop herself, her voice shaking with a fury she had never before allowed herself to show in public. "Is it?" Beatrice's smile was gentle, sorrowful, entirely convincing to anyone who did not know her. "I have a witness, my dear. My own maid saw you leaving His Grace's study late one evening with money in your hand. I take no pleasure in exposing you, truly I do not, but a house cannot be run on charity toward thieves, however sympathetic their circumstances." Whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through dry grass. Alara felt every eye in the church settle on her, felt the old, familiar weight of judgment she had carried since childhood, the assumption, always ready and waiting, that a poor girl with no family to defend her reputation must surely be guilty of whatever she was accused of. Edmund rose from his seat as well, his face white with anger. "Beatrice, this is neither the time nor the—" "It is precisely the time, cousin. I would rather see the matter settled honestly, before witnesses, than watch you continue to shield her out of misplaced sentiment, while your own house crumbles further into ruin." Beatrice turned back to the congregation, her performance of sorrowful duty flawless. "I am certain everyone here understands how difficult it is to see clearly when one's judgment has been clouded by pity, or perhaps by something more than pity." The implication landed exactly as she intended. Alara felt her face burn as several of the assembled ladies exchanged pointed, knowing glances, and understood, with sick clarity, that Beatrice had not merely accused her of theft. She had accused her, in the same breath, of something far more damaging to a young woman with no family to protect her reputation. They left the church in silence, Edmund's hand at her elbow, guiding her past the murmuring crowd with a composure Alara did not believe he actually felt. Neither of them spoke until they were safely inside the carriage, the horses pulling away from the churchyard and its whispering onlookers. "She has no witness," Edmund said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "No maid of hers would have had cause to be near my study at that hour. She is lying, and I intend to prove it." "It does not matter whether it is proven false eventually," Alara said quietly, staring out the carriage window at the passing hedgerows. "It has already been said, in front of everyone who matters in this county. The accusation will follow me regardless of what truth eventually comes out." That is precisely why she chose to make it there, in that way, in front of that many people. "Then we will simply have to make certain the truth follows just as loudly." Easier said, Alara knew, than done. Rumor spread far faster than correction, and by the following morning it seemed the entire village had already heard some version of the story, each retelling slightly more damning than the last. She endured sideways glances from the shopkeepers when she was sent on an errand, endured the sudden, careful distance several of the household staff maintained around her, as though suspicion, once spoken aloud, was contagious enough to avoid touching. Only Mrs. Prout, gruff and unsentimental as ever, seemed entirely unmoved by the accusation. "I have known thieves in my time, girl, and I have known honest souls, And I know which sort you are, she said, setting a cup of tea in front of Alara with rather more force than necessary. Lady Beatrice can say what she likes in a church full of fools. It does not make it so. But not everyone shared Mrs. Prout's certainty, and the damage to Alara's position in the household, however unfair, was real and immediate. Doyle, emboldened by the scandal, grew bolder in his own small cruelties, finding excuses to question her presence in rooms she had every right to enter, murmuring to the other servants that perhaps the accusation held more truth than anyone wished to admit. "You see now," he said to her privately, cornering her one afternoon in the narrow passage outside the kitchen, "how quickly a reputation can be lost, Miss Whitmore, when one forgets one's place. I did warn you." "You did threaten me," Alara corrected coldly. "There is a difference." "Call it what you like." His smile did not reach his eyes. "But consider carefully how much further you wish to push this matter. Accusations, once made, have a way of multiplying, especially against those with no name and no fortune to protect them." She did not answer him, though she felt the threat land exactly as intended, cold and heavy in her stomach. That evening, she found Edmund in the study, working through the tenant testimonies they had gathered, and told him plainly what Doyle had said. "He is trying to frighten you into abandoning the investigation," Edmund said, closing the ledger with barely restrained anger. "It confirms, if anything, how close we must be to something he cannot afford to have discovered. Or it confirms that Lady Beatrice's accusation was never truly about me at all," Alara said slowly, the realization settling into place even as she spoke it. "It was about discrediting me before I could be believed on any other matter. If my word already stands accused of theft and worse, who will believe me when I stand before a bank's clerk and testify against Doyle?" Edmund went very still. "You believe this was strategy, not merely spite." "I believe Lady Beatrice does nothing that does not serve some larger purpose," Alara said. "And I believe we underestimated exactly how far she and Doyle are prepared to go to protect what they have built together." Outside, rain had begun to fall again, drumming steadily against the study windows, and somewhere in the darkened halls of Harlyn Manor, the whispers of the church scandal continued to spread, quiet and corrosive, threatening to undo in a single Sunday morning everything Alara had worked so carefully to build. She had faced fire, theft, and threats in the weeks since her arrival at Harlyn Manor. But nothing had frightened her quite so deeply as this. The understanding that her enemies had found a weapon far more dangerous than any locked drawer or forced door. They had found a way to make the truth itself sound like a lie, simply by attacking the reputation of the person brave enough to speak it. 14 days remained until the bank's deadline. And now, it seemed, Alara would have to fight for her own name at exactly the same moment she fought to save the house that had, however reluctantly at first, become the only home she had left. Peter Ashby came to the manor 2 days later, his curate's collar slightly crooked from what had clearly been a hurried ride, his usually mild face set with unusual determination. He asked to speak with Edmund directly, and Alara, summoned to the study to join them, found him already deep in conversation, a folded paper in his hand. "I have thought of little else since Sunday," Peter said, "and I could not, in good conscience, remain silent while a falsehood was allowed to stand unchallenged. Miss Whitmore was with me, in plain view of the Carrow family and 2 of their neighbors, at the very hour Lady Beatrice's maid claims to have seen her removing money from the study. I have written a statement to that effect, and I am prepared to swear to it before anyone who asks." Relief, sudden and overwhelming, nearly buckled Alara's knees. "You would do that, publicly?" "I would do it gladly," Peter said simply. "A falsehood spoken in a church is not made more true by the setting, Miss Whitmore. If anything, I consider it my particular duty to see it corrected in the very place it was told." Edmund took the statement with hands that were not entirely steady, reading it through twice before setting it carefully on the desk. "This will not undo everything that has been said. Rumor does not retreat simply because it is contradicted, but it is a beginning, and I am more grateful than I can easily say." "Then let us not stop at one statement," Alara said, an idea taking shape even as exhaustion and fear gave way slowly to something more like resolve. The Caro family witnessed the same hour, so did their neighbors. If enough honest voices speak the same truth, loudly enough, in the same places the lie was told, it becomes far harder for anyone to keep believing the lie instead. It was, in its way, the same strategy that had guided their pursuit of Doyle's theft from the beginning. The understanding that a single voice could be dismissed, doubted, threatened into silence, but that many voices, speaking the same careful truth, became something far more difficult to bury. Over the following days, Alara and Edmund gathered not only formal statements but something perhaps more valuable still. The quiet, growing willingness of ordinary people, tenant farmers and shopkeepers and the vicar himself, to speak plainly on her behalf whenever the church scandal was raised in conversation. It was slow work and imperfect. Some doors remained closed to her, some whispers persisted no matter how many honest voices spoke against them. But by the end of the week, the tide of village opinion had begun, gradually, to turn, and Lady Beatrice, Alara noticed with some satisfaction, had grown noticeably quieter on the subject of stolen strongboxes whenever she visited the manor. She did not expect this, Edmund observed one evening, watching Alara add Peter Ashby's statement to the growing collection of evidence they had assembled against Doyle. She expected you to retreat, to accept the shame quietly, the way the world so often expects women in your position to accept whatever is said about them. I have spent my whole life being told what to accept quietly, Alara said. I find I have grown rather tired of it. Something in his expression shifted at that, warm and unguarded in a way she had come to recognize and treasure over the difficult weeks since her arrival. Then I am glad of it, he said softly, because I do not think Harlyn Manor would still stand a chance of surviving this without your particular refusal to accept quietly what you are told. 12 days remained until the bank's deadline, and the accusation that had once threatened to undo everything Alara had built now stood instead, as proof of exactly how far Beatrice and Doyle were willing to go, and exactly how much they feared what she and Edmund together might still uncover. The break came from a direction none of them had anticipated. Nora, a young housemaid who had worked at Harlyn Manor for barely a year, found Alara alone in the linen room on a cold, quiet morning, and closed the door softly behind her before speaking, her voice trembling with a fear she was clearly struggling to master. I have to tell you something, Nora said, twisting her apron between her hands. I should have told you sooner. I have been afraid. Afraid of what? Mr. Doyle. Nora's eyes filled with tears she fought hard not to let fall. 2 years ago, he caught me taking an extra candle stub from the kitchen store, nothing more than that truly, but he threatened to have me dismissed without reference over it, unless I agreed to help him. Small things at first, carrying messages to Lady Beatrice's maid. Watching the study door and telling him who came and went. I did not understand, not fully, what I was helping him do. I swear to you I did not understand. Alara set down the linen she had been folding, her heart quickening. What do you understand now? I know he keeps papers hidden, Nora said, the words spilling out faster now, as though speaking them aloud had broken something loose inside her. Not in the study. In the old gamekeeper's cottage past the east wood, the one that has stood empty since before I came here. I have carried messages there myself, though I never dared go inside. He goes there most Thursday evenings, always alone, always after dark. It was, Alara understood immediately, exactly the kind of evidence they had been searching for since the ransacking of the study. Evidence Doyle believed safely hidden beyond the reach of anyone at the manor. Evidence that might contain the original, unaltered records of 6 years of theft, kept somewhere he believed no one would think to look. Nora, Alara said carefully, I need you to understand that what you are telling me could help save this entire house, but it could also put you in danger if Doyle learns you have spoken. Are you certain you wish to continue? Nora wiped her eyes and nodded, some of the fear in her expression hardening into something more resolute. I have carried his secrets long enough out of fear for myself. I would rather carry the truth now, whatever it costs me. Alara brought the information to Edmund that same evening, and together they made a decision that felt, even as they made it, more dangerous than anything they had yet attempted. They would go to the gamekeeper's cottage themselves, on the coming Thursday, and see with their own eyes what Doyle had been so carefully hiding. The days leading up to it passed with an unbearable, crawling slowness. Alara found herself unable to concentrate on ordinary tasks, her mind returning again and again to the cottage in the East Wood, to the 10 days remaining until the bank's deadline, to the growing certainty that whatever they found on Thursday night would determine, one way or another, whether Harlyn Manor survived at all. Thursday arrived cold and moonless, exactly the kind of night that made the short walk through the East Wood feel considerably longer and considerably more frightening than it would have in daylight. Alara and Edmund left the manor separately, meeting at the edge of the trees, and made their way through the darkness with only a shuttered lantern to guide them, its light kept low and carefully hooded against discovery. The gamekeeper's cottage sat low and dark among the trees, its windows shuttered, its chimney cold. From a careful distance, they watched Doyle arrive on foot shortly after nightfall, letting himself in with a key he produced from an inner pocket, lighting a single candle inside that cast his shadow, huge and distorted, against the thin curtain covering the front window. "We wait," Edmund murmured, close enough that Alara could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cold night air, "until he leaves. Then we see what he has been protecting so carefully." It was nearly 2 hours before Doyle emerged again, locking the door carefully behind him and disappearing back along the path toward the manor, entirely unaware that 2 watchers had marked his every movement from the shadow of the trees. Alara and Edmund waited a further quarter hour, to be certain he had truly gone, before approaching the cottage themselves. The lock proved less of an obstacle than either of them had feared. Edmund's knowledge of estate mechanisms, learned over years of managing a house that could rarely afford proper repairs, served them well enough to force the old latch without excessive noise. Inside, the cottage was small, dusty, and largely bare, exactly the sort of unremarkable space no one would think to search. But in the corner, beneath a loose floorboard Doyle had clearly not expected anyone else to ever find, lay a locked wooden box. It took considerably longer to force the box open than the cottage door, and Alara's hands shook with something beyond the cold as Edmund finally worked the lock free and lifted the lid. Inside lay exactly what they had hoped to find, and more besides. The original, unaltered ledger pages Doyle had removed and replaced with false entries over the years, a private accounting of every sum he had personally taken, and tucked beneath it all, a series of letters between Doyle and Lady Beatrice, discussing in careful, damning detail exactly how the estate's ruin might be engineered to force Edmund into the marriage Beatrice desired. "There is our proof," Edmund said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion Alara could not entirely name, vindication, perhaps, mixed with a grief that seemed to run deeper than the theft alone, the grief of discovering just how thoroughly he had been betrayed by people he had once trusted. They carried the box back to the manor under cover of darkness, hiding it in a place even Nora did not know, and spent the remainder of that night reading through every page by candlelight, building a case so complete, so undeniable, that even Doyle's careful years of deception could not withstand it. The letters between Doyle and Beatrice were, in some ways, the most damning evidence of all. They revealed not merely theft, but a deliberate, calculated conspiracy stretching back nearly as long as Doyle's stewardship itself. A plan to drain the estate slowly enough to avoid immediate suspicion, timed precisely to force Edmund into desperate circumstances exactly when Beatrice's own fortune, and her price for offering it, would seem the only sensible remaining option. "She never cared for this house," Edmund said, reading one particular letter for a third time, his expression carved from something cold and furious. "She cared only for what controlling it could give her, and I very nearly walked directly into the trap she built for me, out of nothing more than desperation and a foolish sense of family loyalty." "You did not walk into it," Alara reminded him gently, "because you did not walk into it. That is the entire point of everything we have done these past weeks." He looked up at her then, across the small mountain of stolen evidence spread between them, and something in his expression softened, grateful and searching, and entirely without the guarded distance he had maintained when she first arrived at Harlyn Manor, unwanted and unnamed and dismissed as nothing more than an act of charity. "I do not know how to properly thank you for this," he said quietly. "You have given me back not only my house, but the truth of who I can trust within it. That is worth more than any sum of money the bank might have demanded." "You do not need to thank me," Alara said. "I told you once that I would rather fight to save this house than watch it fall while pretending I never noticed the cracks. I meant it then. I mean it still." 9 days remained until the bank's deadline. But for the first time since the letter announcing the called loan had arrived, Alara allowed herself to believe, cautiously and with great care, that Harlyn Manor might yet be saved, not by luck, not by charity, but by the stubborn, patient truth she had spent weeks gathering, piece by careful piece, until it became something powerful enough to stand against every lie built to bury it. What she did not yet know, as she finally allowed herself a few hours of exhausted sleep before dawn, was that Doyle had noticed the cottage lock forced open the very next morning, and that his panic, once he understood what had been taken, would send Lady Beatrice's careful conspiracy spiraling toward a far more dangerous confrontation than either of them had yet imagined. Doyle discovered the broken lock on Friday morning, and by midday the entire tenor of Harlyn Manor had shifted, though only Alara and Edmund understood exactly why. Doyle moved through the house with a barely restrained agitation, his usual pleasant smile replaced by something tighter, more watchful, his eyes following Alara whenever their paths crossed with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. "He knows," Alara said quietly, finding Edmund in the study that afternoon. "Or suspects at the very least. He will not simply wait to see what we do next. A cornered man does not wait." She was proven right within hours. That evening, as she carried a tray of tea toward the small drawing room where Edmund had taken to reviewing the recovered evidence each night, Doyle appeared suddenly in the corridor before her, blocking her path entirely, his face pale and furious in the candlelight. "You have been to the cottage," he said, his voice low and shaking with barely controlled rage. "I do not know how you found it, but you have been there, and you have taken what does not belong to you." "I have taken nothing that was not already stolen," Alara answered, forcing her voice steady despite the fear pooling cold in her stomach. "You are the thief here, Mr. Doyle, not I, and your own hand, in your own private ledgers, will prove it plainly enough before a bank's clerk or a magistrate, whichever you would prefer." Something in his expression cracked at that, the careful mask of pleasant competence he had maintained for 6 years, finally giving way to something desperate and dangerous. He stepped closer, close enough that Alara had to force herself not to retreat, not to show him the fear she felt gathering tight in her chest. "You do not understand what you have done," he said, his voice dropping lower still. "There are men in London, moneylenders, who believe certain debts of mine have already been settled with funds I promised them from this estate. If that evidence surfaces publicly, I am not merely dismissed, Miss Whitmore. I am ruined and possibly worse. I would think very carefully, if I were you, about how far you truly wish to push this matter." "Are you threatening me?" "I am warning you," he said, "of consequences you do not yet fully understand. Return what you have taken, and perhaps this can still end quietly without further damage to anyone." "It will not end quietly," Alara said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that her voice did not shake at all as she said it. "It will end honestly, Mr. Doyle. You have had 6 years of quiet, that time is finished." He stared at her for a long, taut moment, something calculating and cold moving behind his eyes, before turning abruptly and disappearing down the corridor without another word. Alara stood frozen in place for several seconds afterward, her heart pounding, before finally continuing toward the drawing room, the tea tray trembling slightly in her hands. Edmund listened to her account of the confrontation with a stillness that frightened her more than any outburst of anger could have. "He threatened you directly," he said finally, "not through implication this time, directly." "He is frightened," Alara said. "Frightened men say dangerous things." Frightened men also do dangerous things, Edmund countered, rising from his chair and crossing to stand close beside her, his hands settling gently on her shoulders in a gesture that felt, despite the danger surrounding them, entirely natural, entirely right. I will not have you facing him alone again, Alara. Whatever happens from here, you do not walk these halls without someone nearby who can protect you if it comes to that. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title attached, and something in the sound of it, spoken so gently amid such danger, settled warm and steady in her chest despite everything. "We are close," she said softly. "I can feel it." He would not have threatened me so plainly unless he understood, truly understood, how little time he has left to stop us. "Then let us make certain he has no time left at all," Edmund said, and together that same night they finished preparing everything necessary to bring their evidence before Fenwick, the bank's senior clerk, and if it came to it, before a magistrate as well. 7 days remained until the deadline. Doyle's panic had confirmed, more clearly than any ledger page could have, exactly how close they had come to the truth, and exactly how dangerous the final days of this fight were about to become. Smoke woke Alara for the second time since her arrival at Harlyn Manor, but this time it was not the stable that burned. It was the study. She smelled it before she heard the shouting, a sharp, acrid edge cutting through her sleep, and by the time she reached the corridor, orange light was already flickering beneath the study door, and Edmund was there ahead of her, beating at the flames with a heavy curtain torn from its rail, his face streaked with soot and fury in equal measure. "The evidence," Alara gasped, understanding immediately what the fire was meant to destroy. "Edmund, the evidence is not in there," he shouted back, over the crackle of flame. "I moved it 2 nights ago to the strongbox in my bedchamber, exactly in case something like this happened. Whoever did this does not know that yet." Together with 2 of the footmen roused by the commotion, they beat the fire back before it could spread beyond the study itself, though the room was left blackened and ruined, papers and furniture reduced to ash and char. When the flames were finally out, Edmund stood in the wreckage, chest heaving, and turned to Alara with an expression of grim, exhausted clarity. "Doyle grows desperate," he said. "Desperate men take desperate risks. This was meant to destroy everything we have built against him, and he very nearly succeeded, save for a precaution I am now deeply grateful I took." But the fire, they would learn by morning, had not been mere desperation alone. A stable boy, questioned quietly by Mrs. Prout, admitted to seeing a figure near the study window shortly before the flames began. A figure too slight and too quick to have been Doyle himself, but familiar enough in build and bearing that the boy hesitantly offered a different name entirely. "It looked like one of Lady Beatrice's own men," he said. "The one who came with her carriage. I did not think much of it at the time, only that it seemed strange for him to be near the house so late, away from the stables where the visiting servants usually kept themselves." It was, Alara understood with a cold, sinking certainty, confirmation of everything she had suspected since the church scandal. Beatrice was no longer content to wait quietly for the estate's ruin to force Edmund's hand. She had moved, decisively and dangerously, into open conspiracy against him, willing now to risk arson rather than allow the truth of her scheme with Doyle to surface. "We must move quickly," Edmund said, once the full implication had settled over them both. "Whatever they intend next, we cannot afford to wait for it to happen." Fenwick agreed to review evidence within the deadline period, not necessarily wait for the deadline itself. "I will ride to the bank myself tomorrow with everything we have gathered, and force the matter to a resolution before Doyle or Beatrice can attempt anything further." The ride to the county bank the following morning felt, to Alara, like walking into battle without any certainty of the outcome. She had insisted on accompanying him, unwilling to remain behind at the manor, while everything they had worked for was finally laid before the one man, whose judgment might determine whether Harlyn Manor survived at all. Edmund had argued against it briefly, worried for her safety given how far Doyle and Beatrice had already proven willing to go, but had ultimately relented, understanding, perhaps, that she had earned the right to see this through to its conclusion beside him, rather than waiting anxiously at home for news. Fenwick received them in a small, book-lined office that smelled of ink and old paper, his expression carefully neutral as Edmund laid out the evidence, piece by careful piece. The recovered ledger pages, the tenant testimonies witnessed and signed, the letters between Doyle and Beatrice detailing their conspiracy in damning, unmistakable detail. The clerk read through everything in silence, his expression giving away nothing, while Alara sat with her hands clenched tight in her lap, trying not to let her fear show, trying to remember that she had already survived far worse than a single afternoon of uncertain waiting. "This is considerable evidence," Fenwick said finally, setting down the last of the letters and removing his spectacles to rub at tired eyes. "Considerable and considerably damning if it holds up to further scrutiny, which I have little reason to doubt that it will. I confess, Your Grace, I had my own quiet suspicions regarding certain figures reported to this bank over recent years. Your steward was, perhaps, slightly too skilled at making numbers appear exactly as convenient as they needed to be." "Then you believe us?" "I believe the evidence before me," Fenwick said carefully. "Which is, I think, precisely what a man in my position ought to believe. I will need time to verify certain details independently, but I am prepared to recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that the bank suspend the current deadline pending a full and formal investigation into estate mismanagement and theft. Given evidence of this nature, calling the loan while the true source of the estate's difficulties remains unresolved would be, I think, both premature and unjust." Relief hit Alara so suddenly and so completely that she had to press her hand flat against the desk to steady herself. Beside her, Edmund let out a long, unsteady breath, the first genuine sign of relief she had seen from him since the letter announcing the called loan had first arrived. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "I do not know how to properly express what this means." "Do not thank me yet," Fenwick cautioned. "A suspended deadline is not a clear debt, and a recommendation is not a certainty. There remains a formal process ahead, and your steward and cousin, if the evidence proves as damning as it appears, will not surrender without further attempts to protect themselves. I would advise both of you to remain vigilant, particularly given what you have described of the fire at your estate last night." The ride back to Harlyn Manor felt entirely different from the ride there, the weight of dread replaced, however cautiously, by something like hope. Edmund reached across the carriage at one point and took Alara's hand in his, holding it gently, wordlessly, as the familiar hedgerows and fields of the estate came back into view. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without you. Not the evidence, not the deadline suspended, not any of it. I was prepared to lose this house quietly, Alara, out of pride too stubborn to ask for help, before you ever arrived to force me to see what was truly happening beneath my own roof. You would have found your way eventually," she said softly. "Perhaps, but I am deeply grateful I did not have to find it alone." He lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so gentle and so entirely unexpected that Alara felt her breath catch in her throat. "I have called you many things since your arrival at this house, Miss Whitmore, though never once, I think, what you truly deserve to be called. Not a charity case, not merely an asset to the estate's finances. Something far more important than either." "And what is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I have come, against every careful intention I once held, to care for a great deal more than I ever expected to allow myself." He looked at her then, searching, uncertain in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar on a man who had spent so many months wearing the careful, guarded composure of a duke burdened by ruin. "I do not know what the days ahead will bring for this house or for either of us, but I find I no longer wish to face them without you beside me." Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, warm and overwhelming after weeks of fear and exhaustion and careful, desperate hope. "I have nothing to offer you," she said softly, "beyond what I have already given. No fortune, no family name to strengthen yours." "You have offered me the truth," Edmund said, when everyone around me was content to let me drown in comfortable lies. You have offered me courage when I had very nearly forgotten what it looked like. I do not require a fortune or a family name, Alara. I require, I think, exactly what you have already given so freely, without ever once expecting anything in return. The carriage rolled on through the golden afternoon light, and for a few precious moments, amid all the danger still circling Harlyn Manor, Alara allowed herself simply to feel the warmth of his hand in hers, and the quiet, growing certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it as an unwanted charity case any longer, but as someone whose place in this house, and in the heart of the man who ruled it, had been fully and completely earned. But even as hope bloomed cautiously between them, danger had not finished circling. 5 days remained until the original deadline, now suspended but not forgotten, and somewhere at that very moment, Lady Beatrice Calloway, informed by a frightened, cornered Doyle of everything the bank now knew, was already beginning to plan a final, desperate move to protect herself from the ruin closing in around them both. Lady Beatrice arrived at Harlyn Manor uninvited the following afternoon, her carriage rattling up the drive with none of its usual leisurely grace, and demanded, through Mrs. Prout, a private audience with Alara alone. Edmund objected immediately, unwilling to allow it, but Alara, after a long moment of consideration, placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Let me speak with her," she said quietly. "Whatever she intends, I would rather understand it directly than wonder at it from a distance." They met in the small morning room, the door left deliberately ajar, with Edmund waiting close enough in the corridor beyond to hear if anything went wrong. Beatrice looked, for the first time since Alara had known her, genuinely unsettled, her usual composed elegance frayed at the edges, her hands not quite steady as she seated herself. "You have made a formidable enemy of me, Miss Whitmore," she said, without preamble. "I confess I did not expect a servant girl to prove such an obstacle." "I am not your enemy, Lady Beatrice. I only wish to see the truth uncovered." "The truth," Beatrice's laugh was brittle, humorless. "The truth is a luxury afforded to people with fortunes large enough to survive its consequences. I do not have that luxury, whatever you may believe of me. My father's estate is nearly as burdened as this one. I saw an opportunity to secure both our futures, and I took it. That is not villainy, Miss Whitmore. That is simply how the world I was raised in operates. By stealing from tenant farmers who can scarcely afford to lose what little they have. By threatening a young girl's reputation in front of an entire church. I do not believe desperation excuses either." Something flickered across Beatrice's face, shame perhaps, or something closer to fear. "I am prepared to offer you a considerable sum," she said finally. "To persuade Edmund the evidence you have gathered is less certain than it appears. Enough money to secure a future far beyond anything this house could ever offer a girl in your position. You need never work another day in service again." Alara felt something cold and clear settle over her. The last uncertainty she might have harbored about Beatrice's character finally, completely resolved. "You are asking me to become exactly the kind of thief you, and Mr. Doyle, have already proven yourselves to be. I am offering you a choice most people in your position would consider a gift." "I have already made my choice, Lady Beatrice," Alara said, rising from her seat, her voice steady despite the tension coiled tight in her chest. "I made it the night I first read those ledgers and understood what was truly happening to this house. No sum of money will change it now." Beatrice's composure cracked entirely at that, something desperate and furious surfacing beneath her carefully maintained elegance. "You do not understand what you are refusing," she hissed. "Doyle will not simply accept ruin quietly, and neither, I promise you, will I. You have made a very dangerous choice today, Miss Whitmore, and I hope for your sake you do not come to regret it." She swept from the room without another word, her carriage rattling away down the drive with the same urgent haste it had arrived with. Edmund appeared in the doorway a moment later, his expression grim. "You heard everything," Alara said, not quite a question. "Enough of it. She threatened you directly, Alara. That is no longer ambiguous, no longer something we can attribute to Doyle's desperation alone. He crossed the room and took her hands in his grip firm and warm and steadying. "Whatever she intends next, I will not allow it to touch you. I promise you that, whatever else happens to this house or to me." Alara nodded, though the cold weight of Beatrice's threat lingered in her chest long after the carriage had disappeared from view. 4 days remained until the deadline that had, however tenuously, been suspended, and it was clear now, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that Beatrice Calloway did not intend to accept defeat quietly. Whatever final, desperate move she and Doyle had left to make, it was coming soon, and it was coming. Alara understood with a shiver she could not quite suppress, directly for her. The note arrived just after dark, slipped beneath the kitchen door where anyone might have found it, though it was addressed, in careful, deliberate handwriting, to Alara alone. "Come to the old mill by the river," it read, "if you wish to see the last of Doyle's hidden records before he burns them himself. Come alone, or he will destroy everything before morning." Alara read it twice, her heart hammering, torn between the instinct to bring it immediately to Edmund and the fear that any delay might mean losing evidence they had fought so hard to gather. She knew, even as she considered it, that the note carried every hallmark of a trap. But the thought of losing, at this final stage, the last piece of proof that might fully condemn Doyle and Beatrice together was more than she could bear to risk. She left a hurried, half-finished note of her own for Edmund, tucked beneath a book on his desk where she knew he would find it eventually, and slipped out into the cold night alone, telling herself she would simply look, simply confirm whether the note held any truth at all, before doing anything reckless. The old mill stood dark and silent beside the river, its great wheel long since stopped turning, its windows broken and empty. Alara approached cautiously, her lantern shuddered low, every instinct screaming at her to turn back even as she pressed forward. She found Doyle waiting inside, alone, a single lantern casting long shadows across the dust and broken machinery. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked, instead, resigned, exhausted in a way that frightened her more than his earlier anger had. "You came," he said quietly. "I confess I was not entirely certain you would. Where are the records?" "There are no records here, Miss Whitmore. I'm afraid I lied about that. In the note I asked to be delivered to you." He set down his lantern on an old, dust-covered workbench, and for the first time since she had known him, his careful composure seemed to entirely abandon him. "I find myself tonight with very few good choices remaining, and I am afraid I have made rather a poor one in bringing you here." Fear coiled cold and sharp in Alara's stomach. "What do you mean?" "Lady Beatrice believes that if you disappear, even briefly, the investigation loses its most determined voice. She believes His Grace, distracted by fear for your safety, will be less inclined to pursue the matter as relentlessly as he has thus far." Doyle's hands trembled visibly in the lantern light. "I did not wish to agree to this. I want you to believe that, whatever else you think of me. But I am a desperate man, Miss Whitmore, with debts in London that will see me imprisoned, or worse, if this evidence surfaces publicly, and desperate men do not always make choices they can be proud of." "You intend to keep me here?" "I intend," Doyle said, "to give you a chance to leave this county entirely tonight with enough money to start a new life somewhere far from Harlyn Manor, in exchange for your silence, and for whatever remaining evidence you have not yet surrendered to the bank. It is not the cruelest choice available to me, Miss Whitmore. I want you to understand that I have tried, in my own small way, to offer you a mercy Lady Beatrice would not extend. And if I refuse?" Doyle's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. Alara felt real fear then, sharp and immediate, understanding fully for the first time exactly how far this conspiracy had been prepared to go. But beneath the fear, something steadier held firm, the same stubborn refusal that had carried her through weeks of danger and doubt. "You are already ruined, Mr. Doyle," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the trembling she felt everywhere else. "The evidence already sits with the bank. Fenwick has already begun his investigation. Whatever happens to me tonight changes nothing about what you have already lost." Something flickered across his face, doubt perhaps, or the first cracks of a conscience he had spent years learning to ignore. Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside, fast and urgent, and the mill door burst open to reveal Edmund, breathless, his face carved from pure fury and terror in equal measure. "Get away from her," he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Alara had never heard from him before. Doyle backed away instinctively, hands raised, whatever remained of his resolve crumbling entirely in the face of Edmund's fury. "Your Grace, I did not intend. You lured her here with a lie in the middle of the night, alone." Edmund crossed the mill floor in swift strides, positioning himself between Doyle and Alara without hesitation. "Whatever you intended, you have proven, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly what kind of man you truly are. I found your note," he said to Alara without turning from Doyle, "the moment I returned to the study. I have never in my life ridden so fast." His voice, when it finally softened enough to address her directly, shook with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Are you harmed? Alara, look at me. Are you harmed?" "I am unharmed," she said, and found, once she said it aloud, that it was entirely true. "He did not touch me. He only wished to frighten me into silence." Doyle, given the sudden shift in circumstance, seemed to understand with dawning horror exactly how thoroughly his position had collapsed. "Beatrice arranged this," he said quickly, desperately. "It was her plan, not mine alone. I can prove it, Your Grace, if you are willing to let the matter rest with the authorities rather than settling it here, tonight, in whatever manner your anger currently favors." "Get out of my sight," Edmund said, his voice flat and cold. "You will present yourself to the magistrate tomorrow morning, with every remaining piece of evidence still in your possession, or I promise you, Mr. Doyle, the mercy you have just witnessed tonight will not be extended to you a second time." Doyle fled into the darkness without another word, leaving Edmund and Alara alone in the dim lantern light of the old mill. The moment the sound of his footsteps faded entirely, Edmund turned to her fully, his composure finally, completely breaking, and pulled her into an embrace so fierce, and so relieved that Alara felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes. "I thought I might lose you," he said into her hair, his voice raw. "I have faced the loss of this house with something close to resignation these past months. I did not know, until tonight, how differently I would feel facing the possibility of losing you instead." "You have not lost me," Alara said softly, her arms tightening around him in return. "I am here, I am safe, we have won Edmund. Whatever else happens now, we have won." He pulled back just far enough to look at her properly, the lantern light catching the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the danger of the night finally, fully giving way to something gentler, something that had been building quietly between them since a fire-lit courtyard weeks before. When he finally kissed her, it was slow and careful, and entirely without the guarded distance that had once defined every interaction between the Duke of Harlyn and the girl the household had once dismissed as nothing more than his charity case. "I love you," he said simply, when they finally parted, the words offered without hesitation or careful calculation, exactly as honestly as everything else she had come to know about him since the night of the stable fire. "I do not know precisely when it happened, only that it did, somewhere between ledgers and threats, and a courage I have never once seen matched by anyone else in my life." "I love you too," Alara answered, and found the words came easily, naturally, as though she had simply been waiting for the right moment to finally say them aloud. "I did not come to this house expecting to find anything beyond shelter and quiet survival. I did not expect to find you." They rode back to Harlyn Manor together as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon, and though danger had not entirely finished with them yet, Doyle's confession still to be secured, Beatrice's final reckoning still to come, Alara felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely, completely certain that whatever remained ahead, she would not face it as an unwanted charity case, forgotten and dismissed, but as the woman the Duke of Harlyn had come to love, trust, and need in equal measure. True to his word, though driven far more by fear than by any genuine change of heart, Doyle appeared before the county magistrate the following morning, pale and shaking, and confessed to everything: 6 years of falsified accounts, the theft of tenant rents, the conspiracy with Lady Beatrice to engineer the estate's ruin, and finally, the desperate scheme to lure Alara to the old mill the night before. He surrendered every remaining scrap of evidence still in his possession, hoping, transparently, that full cooperation might soften whatever punishment awaited him. Word reached Lady Beatrice within hours, carried, Alara suspected, by one of her own informants still lingering somewhere within the household staff. By the time a constable arrived at her father's estate to question her formally, Beatrice had already fled, her rooms left in hurried disarray, her most valuable jewelry and a considerable sum of ready money gone along with her. "She will not get far," Edmund said, when the news reached Harlyn Manor that afternoon. "A woman traveling alone in haste with a warrant already following her rarely evades capture for long, but I confess I take little satisfaction in the chase itself. I only wish this had never needed to happen at all." "She made her choices," Alara said gently, sensing the complicated grief beneath his words, the particular pain of watching family reveal itself capable of such calculated betrayal. "You did not force her hand, she forced her own." "I know it. And yet," he shook his head, some of the day's exhaustion finally showing plainly on his face, "I once thought her merely ambitious, perhaps unkind. I did not think her capable of arson, of threatening a woman she knew to be entirely innocent, of building an entire scheme upon another family's ruin. I am not certain I will ever fully understand how I failed to see it sooner." "You saw it," Alara reminded him softly, "once someone finally showed you where to look." He managed a tired, grateful smile at that, and reached for her hand across the small distance between them. "Then let us hope," he said, "that the worst of it is finally, truly behind us." 3 days remained until the original deadline, now formally and permanently withdrawn given the magistrate's findings, and though Beatrice's flight left one final thread of the conspiracy still unresolved, Alara felt, for the first time since the letter announcing the called loan had first arrived, that Harlyn Manor's darkest days had finally, decisively passed. They found Lady Beatrice 2 weeks later, at a coaching inn near the coast, attempting to secure passage on a ship bound for the continent under a name that was not her own. She was brought back under guard to stand before the magistrate, and though the proceedings that followed were long, painful, and thoroughly humiliating for a family once counted among the county's most respected, Alara took no pleasure in watching them unfold. She felt, instead, a quiet, sober relief that the truth, however difficult, had finally been allowed to stand fully in the light. Doyle's cooperation, however self-serving its origin, earned him a lighter sentence than his crimes might otherwise have warranted, though he would spend several years answering for 6 years of theft. Beatrice's fate proved harsher still, her family's reputation permanently and irreparably damaged, her own future narrowed considerably by the scandal she had worked so hard to prevent Edmund from ever fully escaping. "I find I feel almost sorry for her," Alara admitted one evening, weeks after the magistrate's final ruling, as she and Edmund walked together through the newly restored east wing of Harlyn Manor, its windows finally repaired, its furniture uncovered and polished, sunlight pouring once more through glass that had stood clouded and cracked for years. "You are kinder than her scheme deserved," Edmund said, though there was no real reproach in his voice. "But I understand the feeling. Desperation makes people capable of things they might never otherwise have attempted. It does not excuse what she did, but I do not think it entirely without its own quiet tragedy either." The restoration of Harlyn Manor, once the stolen funds were recovered, and the estate's finances finally, properly untangled from years of theft and mismanagement, proceeded far more swiftly than either of them had dared to hope. Fenwick himself, impressed by the thoroughness of the evidence Alara had gathered, took a personal interest in helping restructure the estate's remaining obligations, and within months, the crushing weight of debt that had hung over Harlyn Manor since before Edmund had ever inherited the title finally began, at last, to lift. Tenant farms that had struggled for years under unfair, falsified rent demands were finally restored to honest terms, and the gratitude of families like the Caros, who had risked so much to offer their testimony, settled into something warmer and more lasting than mere relief. The estate's tenants, once wary and distant toward a house they had come to associate with quiet unfairness, began, slowly, to trust it again. And Alara found, walking the lanes she had once traveled in fear and secrecy, that she was greeted now with genuine warmth rather than cautious suspicion. The household staff, too, had changed in their regard for her. Mrs. Prout, never one for excessive sentiment, nonetheless began treating Alara with something closer to open respect than she had ever shown a servant girl before. And even the maids who had once whispered charity case in careless corners now spoke of her, when they spoke of her at all, with something closer to admiration. Nora, whose courage in finally revealing Doyle's hidden cottage had proven so crucial, remained close to Alara in the months that followed, the two of them forming a quiet, steady friendship built on a shared understanding of what it meant to find courage in the midst of genuine fear. It was on a soft spring evening, nearly 6 months after the fire that had first thrown them together in the stable courtyard, that Edmund led Alara out to the very same spot where they had first stood together, soot-streaked and breathless, strangers who had not yet understood what they would come to mean to one another. The stable had been fully rebuilt by then, its new timber pale and clean against the older stone of the surrounding buildings, and the horses within it, safe and settled, nickered softly in the evening quiet. "Do you remember this place?" Edmund asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "I remember it very well," Alara said, smiling. "It was rather a dramatic first meeting, as I recall." "It was," he agreed. "And I confess I have thought of it often since, though not at first, for the reasons I might have expected. I thought of it because it was the first time I looked at you and saw someone who refused to be frightened away from doing what was right, regardless of the danger involved. I did not understand, that night, how thoroughly that quality would come to change my life." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, simple ring, its setting modest compared to what a duke might ordinarily be expected to offer, though Alara understood, immediately and completely, exactly why he had chosen it. A plain, honest thing without pretense, exactly like the woman he was offering it to. "I do not have a grand fortune to offer you, not yet, though I hope in time this house will provide considerably more comfort than it currently can," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, his composure wavered slightly, genuine nervousness showing plainly beneath his usual careful steadiness. "I do not have an easy history to offer you either, given everything this past year has revealed about my own family. But I have my whole heart, Alara Whitmore, entirely and completely, and I find I cannot imagine facing whatever comes next in my life without you standing beside me exactly as you have stood beside me through everything already. Will you marry me?" Alara felt tears gather, warm and overwhelming as she looked at him, at the man who had once greeted her with cold formality and now stood before her, nervous and hopeful and entirely without pretense, offering her not charity, not pity, but genuine, equal partnership. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and when he kissed her, gentle and unhurried in the soft evening light, Alara felt, for the first time in her entire life, the complete and certain knowledge that she belonged somewhere, wanted not out of obligation or pity, but because of exactly who she was. The wedding took place that autumn, in the same small village church where Beatrice had once tried so publicly to destroy Alara's reputation, and Alara found a particular, quiet satisfaction in exchanging her vows in that very place, surrounded now not by whispers and suspicion, but by the warm, genuine goodwill of tenants and villagers who had come to know and trust her over the difficult months before. Peter Ashby, the curate whose testimony had helped clear her name, performed the ceremony himself, his usually mild face bright with genuine happiness as he pronounced them husband and wife before a church filled entirely with well-wishers. Mrs. Prout cried, though she would never have admitted it aloud, and Nora stood proudly among the small gathering of household staff who had come to witness the marriage of the girl once dismissed as nothing more than a charity case to the Duke she had, through nothing but her own courage and determination, helped save from complete ruin. In the years that followed, Harlyn Manor flourished under their joint stewardship, its finances carefully and honestly managed, its tenant farms prosperous once more, its rooms filled with warmth and laughter rather than the cold, careful silence that had once defined it. Alara continued to involve herself closely in the estate's management, her sharp mind and careful attention to detail proving, again and again, exactly as valuable as it had during the darkest months of their fight against Doyle and Beatrice's conspiracy. Edmund, for his part, never once forgot, nor let her forget, exactly how much he owed to the quiet, determined young woman his mother had insisted on her deathbed must never be turned away. And though the county would speak for years afterward of the scandal that had once nearly destroyed Harlyn Manor, of the Duke's cousin who had fled in disgrace, and the steward who had spent years quietly stealing from the very people who trusted him, they spoke far more often, and far more warmly, of a different story entirely. The story of a penniless girl once called nothing more than a charity case, who had looked closely at what everyone else had chosen not to see, and who had, through nothing but her own honesty and courage, rescued an entire house from ruin, and found, in doing so, a home and a love she had never once expected to find. It became, in time, the story the villagers told their own children on quiet evenings, a reminder that worth was never truly measured by fortune or family name, but by the quiet, stubborn strength to seek out truth even when it would have been far easier and far safer to look away. A year after their wedding, on the anniversary of the night the study had nearly burned to ash around them, Edmund found Alara in the newly restored library, curled into a window seat with the estate's current accounts spread across her lap, a habit she had never entirely abandoned even after the danger that had first driven her to it had long since passed. "Still checking the numbers," he said, settling beside her with a fond, familiar smile. "Even now, when there is nothing left to uncover." "Old habits," Alara said, though she set the ledger aside easily enough to lean into him. "Besides, I find I still enjoy it. There is a particular satisfaction in watching numbers finally tell an honest story." He laughed, low and warm, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "The tenant farms report their best harvest in a decade. Fenwick writes that the estate's remaining debts will be fully cleared within another 2 years, well ahead of what we once dared hope. And I received word this morning that Mr. Ashby has finally convinced the bishop to fund the repair of the church roof, a project I understand you had rather a large hand in encouraging." "It seemed only right," Alara said. "Given everything that church once witnessed, both the worst of it and, eventually, the best." Outside the library window, the grounds of Harlyn Manor stretched green and well-tended toward the horizon, the stable rebuilt and thriving, the tenant cottages repaired, the great house itself finally, fully restored to the quiet dignity it had once nearly lost entirely. Nora, now promoted to assist Mrs. Prout in managing the household, could be heard somewhere below, laughing at some shared joke with one of the younger maids, the sound drifting up through the open window like the simplest, sweetest kind of proof that the darkness which had once hung so heavily over this house had truly, finally lifted. "Do you ever think of it?" Edmund asked quietly, after a comfortable silence had settled between them. "That first night, the stable fire, how close we came in those early days to losing everything in more ways than one." "Often," Alara admitted, "though I think of it now with gratitude rather than fear. If Doyle had never grown careless enough to leave that ledger open on the kitchen table, if the fire had never forced us to stand together in that courtyard, I do not know that either of us would have found the courage to see what was truly happening beneath this roof, let alone the courage to fight for it." "I think of it with gratitude as well," Edmund said softly, "though mostly, I confess, because it was the night I first met the woman who would come to mean more to me than this entire estate, ruin and all." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity of a year's shared marriage. "They called you my charity case once, Alara. I have thought often how entirely wrong that description was from the very first night. You were never charity. You were, from the very beginning, exactly what this house, and this family most desperately needed, though none of us had the wisdom yet to see it. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the late afternoon sun spill golden across the restored grounds of Harlyn Manor, and felt, with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every danger of that difficult first year, that she had finally, completely found the place she truly belonged. Not through pity and not through charity, but through her own stubborn refusal to look away from the truth, and through the love of a man who had, in the end, proven every bit as brave and honest as she had once dared to hope he could be. The house that had once nearly fallen to ruin now stood strong around them, its walls holding not the cold silence of debt and deception, but the warm, steady sound of a family finally, fully healed. Spring came early to Harlyn Manor, the year their first child was born, the orchards blooming nearly a full month ahead of the county's usual season, as though the estate itself had chosen to celebrate alongside its master and mistress. Alara remembered little of the actual hours of labor beyond exhaustion and fear and, finally, overwhelming relief, but she remembered with perfect clarity the moment Edmund placed their daughter in her arms for the first time, his face wet with tears he made no attempt to hide, his voice breaking as he whispered her name for the first time. They named her Margaret, after Edmund's mother, the old duchess whose deathbed promise had first brought Alara to Harlyn Manor as a penniless, unwanted girl with nowhere else in the world to go. It felt, to both of them, like the truest possible way to honor a woman who had seen, long before anyone else, exactly what Alara might one day become to this house, and to her son. She would have loved this, Edmund said quietly, watching Alara nurse their daughter by the fire that first evening, the whole household hushed with the particular tenderness a new birth brings even to the most practical of servants. She always believed you would be an asset to this family. I do not think even she imagined quite how completely that would prove true. Margaret grew quickly, as children do, filling the once silent halls of Harlyn Manor with laughter and small, determined footsteps, and Alara found herself, in the years that followed, teaching her daughter many of the same lessons her own parents had once taught her without quite meaning to, an eye for careful numbers, a stubborn refusal to accept easy lies over difficult truths, a quiet, steady kindness toward everyone in the household regardless of their station. Nora, by then a trusted friend as much as a member of staff, often remarked that Margaret had inherited her mother's particular talent for noticing exactly the things everyone else preferred to overlook, a trait that occasionally proved inconvenient during games of hide and seek through the manor's many restored rooms, but which Alara secretly hoped her daughter would carry with her always. The estate itself continued to prosper. Within 5 years of Doyle's conviction, every debt that had once threatened to swallow Harlyn Manor whole had been fully and honestly cleared, the tenant farms yielding steady, fair returns, the household running on a foundation of careful, transparent management that Alara herself continued to oversee alongside Edmund, her role in the estate's affairs never once questioned by anyone who remembered how thoroughly she had earned it. Fenwick, who had become something of a family friend in the years since his careful, cautious investigation had first saved the estate from ruin, visited often, always remarking with quiet pride on how far Harlyn Manor had come since those desperate early days. "I have overseen the finances of a great many estates in my career," he told Alara once, watching Margaret chase a small spaniel across the newly replanted gardens, "and I can say, with complete honesty, that I have never seen one so thoroughly and so honestly restored as this. It is, I think, entirely to your credit, your grace, whatever modesty you might offer in response." Alara only smiled, watching her daughter's laughter carry across the grounds that had once stood so close to ruin, and thought of all the careful, patient work that had brought them to this moment. The ledgers read by candlelight, the tenant testimonies gathered with such danger and difficulty, the courage it had taken to stand firm against threats and scandal and fire alike. It had not been easy. It had at times felt nearly impossible. But standing now in the golden light of a restored garden, watching her family thrive in a house that had once cast her aside as nothing more than an unwanted burden, Alara understood completely that every difficult, frightening step of that journey had been worth it. Doyle, released eventually from his imprisonment, a broken and diminished man, wrote once years later, a letter of genuine and apparently sincere apology, which Edmund read carefully before deciding, after long consideration, to allow a small pension to reach the man in his old age, not out of any lingering fondness, but out of the same quiet, principled fairness that had come to define how Harlyn Manor conducted itself in all matters, even toward those who had once wronged it most deeply. Lady Beatrice they heard only occasionally, through distant relations, having settled eventually in a modest household abroad, her fortune and reputation both considerably diminished, though never entirely destroyed. Alara felt, whenever news of her reached Harlyn Manor, not satisfaction exactly, but a quiet, settled peace, the particular peace that comes from knowing a difficult chapter has been fully and honestly closed, its consequences allowed to unfold exactly as they should, without bitterness lingering on either side. The village, too, had changed in the years since the scandal that once threatened to define Alara's entire reputation. Children who had grown up hearing whispered, half-true versions of the story now grew into adults who spoke instead of the Duchess of Harlyn's remarkable courage, her sharp mind, her tireless dedication to fairness for tenant and staff alike. The church where Beatrice had once tried to destroy her name became, instead, the site of countless happier occasions. Christenings, weddings, the ordinary joyful business of a community healed and thriving, its roof, thanks in no small part to Alara's quiet encouragement, finally sound against the weather it had weathered so poorly for so many years. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and Margaret had finally been coaxed to sleep, Alara and Edmund often returned to the same window seat in the library where they had once, a year into their marriage, spoken of gratitude and old fears finally laid to rest. It became, over the years, a small ritual between them, a moment set aside from the daily business of running a great and thriving estate to simply remember, together, exactly how far they had come. "Do you remember," Edmund asked one such evening, many years after the fire that had first brought them together, "how frightened I was that first morning when you told me someone was stealing from this house?" "I remember," Alara said, smiling against his shoulder. "You looked at me as though I had personally set the stable ablaze myself." "I looked at you," he corrected gently, "as though I had no idea yet what I was looking at." A girl the household dismissed as nothing more than an obligation, who would go on to save everything I hold dear, and become, in the process, the very thing I hold most dear of all. He pressed a soft kiss to her hair, the gesture as natural now as breathing, worn smooth by years of shared quiet evenings just like this one. "They called you my charity case, Alara. I have never once, since that very first night, believed it to be true. You were never something this house gave to. You were always, from the very beginning, exactly what this house, and this family, needed most in order to survive." Outside the library window, the grounds of Harlyn Manor stretched peaceful and green beneath a gathering evening sky, the stable that had once nearly burned to the ground now standing sturdy and full of well-tended horses, the tenant farms golden with a harvest grown honest and fair, the great house itself finally, completely whole in every sense that mattered. It had taken fire and theft and betrayal, and a courage neither of them had fully understood themselves capable of, to bring them to this quiet, contented evening. But looking now at the life they had built together, from the ashes of near ruin into something lasting and true, Alara understood, with the same steady certainty that had carried her through every danger of that first difficult year, that it had all, every frightening and uncertain moment of it, been worth the fight. The girl once called nothing more than the Duke's charity case had in the end become something the entire county remembered instead as its truest example of quiet, unshakable courage. A reminder, passed down through the years that followed, that worth was never a matter of birth or fortune, but of the steady, patient refusal to look away from the truth, no matter how much easier it might have been to simply let the house, and everyone within it, quietly fall to ruin.